Welcome to the DooDoo Diva Smells Like Money podcast. I'm your host, Suzan Chin-Taylor, CEO and founder of Creative Raven, the firm that helps wastewater industry contractors and manufacturers unlock the power of digital marketing, AI, and PR to boost sales and opportunities. Whether it's through our online marketing and lead generation programs or providing a fully outsourced marketing department, we are passionate about helping businesses in the wastewater and civil infrastructure sectors not just survive, but thrive in today's digital world. Each episode, I'll be bringing you expert tips and strategies to help you grow and succeed. Let's dive in. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the DooDoo Divas Smells Like Money podcast. We are continuing our conversation with Charlie Lerman, aka the Grout Geek. I'll say it right this episode, the Grout Geek. And he is the Western Regional Manager at NCFI Geotechnical. And Charlie is just an absolute wealth of knowledge. I am so enjoying speaking with him. We met via LinkedIn. We've probably known each other in the industry, probably have met at a trade show, but just didn't make the recognition. We've both been around for so many years. We probably just don't recognize each other as we, age. So for today's purposes of the episode, and I teased it for last time, our last episode, we talked about the nuances of hydrophilic versus hydrophobic. But today we're going to be talking about the term single and dual component. But we were talking offline, and before we get into that, I started to get a little confused because I've heard these terms used as it relates to polyureas and polyurethanes for structural rehabilitation. And then Charlie pops one on me that it's also referred to as these other things. And for those of you in your layman's world, when you hear the term grout, I know what I think of. That's stuff that's between the tiles in your shower or on your floor in the tiles, or caulking, that stuff that seals the water. But nothing, not that it's further from the truth. That is one way that grout could be used. And then Charlie told me a little interesting historical factoid. And Charlie, welcome back to the show. And I want you to share with the audience what you just told me about the history of the word grout, and how sometimes its term within our industry can sometimes get really confusing, and how maybe we can weed through that mess.
So thank you again for having me back on, Susan. I love any opportunity to get information out there. But yeah, as you know, my self-titled Grout Geek, I had to learn a little extra stuff. So when you look at the term grout, actually, I think it was around the 1600s. It was a porridge. And when porridge, when you let it sit there in your bowl after a while and it gets cold, it hardens up. And so that's where the original term for grout came from. It was a porridge there. But then a few years later, in 1995, the Corps of Engineers came out and said that any liquid that is injected and has a set time period for it to turn into a rigid or a gel, that's how they define a grout. They do it a little better than I just did. I did that off the top of my head, but they have a definition that came out. And that was basically Moses with the 10 Commandments coming down for the construction industry saying, this is what a grout is. Okay. But grouts, they can be polyurethane, they can be cementitious, they can be epoxy. There's tons of different grouts. And when you look at just the construction industry, about 95% of the grouting is cementitious. 5% of that is chemical, and about 1% is polyurethane. Okay. Now I haven't updated those numbers in probably 10 years, so I may be off a bit on that, but that's what I recall there. So we're in this niche industry, but yes, I have the Grout Geek at gmail.com, and I get all the times. There's these other Grout Geeks that clean tile over on the East Coast, and I get emails for them all the time. So there's a lot of confusion on what grouting even means.
Oh, well, thank you for that. So let's just jump into today's topic and let you just go down the rabbit hole however you want to on the topic of single versus dual component, what that means, why does it matter to the audience, How does it affect what you choose to do for a project or application for the best outcome? And any other little, what I call Charlie's Grout Geek pearls of wisdom to the industry on the topic of single or plural or dual, whatever we're going to call it. Sometimes it's dual, sometimes it's plural, but basically means the same thing.
So real quick, we're always referring to, I say always, in this podcast here, we're talking about polyurethane grouts, and that's my area of expertise. When you look at single component grouts, as we talked about before, you have hydrophilic, which is a true single component. Hydrophobic single component, they actually have an activator. So when I teach, I stand in front of everybody and I hold up two buckets and I'm like, this is our single component. Well, there's two parts to it. Why is it called single component? Because it pumps with a single component pump. It's not going to go off till it sees water. There's no pot life. So that's why it's still considered single component. Okay. Now, when we compare that to dual component or not plural, but dual component polyurethanes, these are grout is a hard term to use to call them grout, but people often say I grout with them. You see what I'm saying? So there's a lot of weird stuff on how things are put. They both polymerize it into a foam. The chemistries, they're isocyanates. They're very relatable. They have the hydrophobic properties, some of them, and some are not hydrophobic, but they're not. There's no hydrophilic two components, but there are two component foams that don't like to react with water, depending on the blowing agent they use. But typically for those, let's back up. Let's talk about equipment first. For single component, we're typically at an airless paint sprayer. They can come out of a cock tube. You can get a little drill pump. Airless paint sprayer is the ideal way. It's what I like to push. It's the way it goes. And that's just, a couple $1,000, your airless paint sprayer, and you're good to go in starting your single component grouting industry or company. If you're looking at getting a dual component, you're about $120,000 with a rig to get a nice reactor set up in there. These are heated lines. You typically have about 300 feet of heated lines. The handling of it's a lot more difficult, but the product itself is actually a lot more or a lot less expensive than single component grouts. All right, so you can put a lot more in the ground and cover a lot bigger area than you can with single component. One of the biggest problems we have with single component jobs is I have someone come and say, I had this giant single component job. I'm like, probably not giant, because when people see the cost of that, they're not going to do it. That's one of the downsides of single component, is that they're costly and they're much slower to install than your two component. So we're going to look at this through the lens of waterproofing. And specifically, let's talk about waterproofing manholes. Now, there's been companies that go out and they use two component on manholes, but typically more towards storm drains and stuff like that. And they'll seal them up in culverts, and they can do a good job with that. Single component can also do that, probably a little more expensive with a lower entry fee. Here's the big difference. When we're looking at waterproofing, if I'm waterproofing a manhole and I take it from 10 gallons a minute down to just a trickle, that's a big win. Everybody's happy with that. When I'm waterproofing a doctor, lawyer, someone's a fancy basement with their wine cellar, and I stop 99% of the water, that means it's 100% leaking there. All right, that is totally unacceptable. So we got to look at, first off, where are we doing our waterproofing? What do we have to get to in our criteria? Single components shine for 100% waterproofing. You can slow them down enough that they can travel, have plenty of time to set up, and they're going to chase where that water is going and migrate to that area. That's their advantage. That's also their weakness, that we're injecting this on concrete behind us, and if there's a high water flow or a big void, they've just traveled and they're gone, and we don't even know where they went. So we have to employ stage grouting, where we pump a little bit, wait, and do that kind of thing. It's a slow process. Two component, there's a void back there, pump, fill that void, it doesn't care, boom, it goes off. But because it goes off so quick, it often forms columns that aren't necessarily connected. And if you have a gap between those columns, that's where the water's coming in. So what I like to tell people who have access to both sets of equipment, and if you have two components, there's no reason you shouldn't be using single component. Okay, I mean, going out and buying an air paint sprayer is easy. When you're looking at waterproofing, plan on being able to use both. Sometimes we know we're going to have voids, or we're going to have let's say some peat, or we're going to have some gravel, something that's going to just eat up single component with that travel. Yes, you can speed up single component to try to get it to go off faster and stay in your area, but you can just nail that with two component and solidify that. And then as you need, come in with the more expensive, the slower, the time consuming process of getting it dialed in on your waterproofing. But you've done a lot of the heavy lifting with a cheaper and faster process. And I think that's a big game changer for the sewer industry, because right now most people look towards most people that are working in there. They have these large trucks for pumping acrylamide, and they want to use acrylamide the same way on the manhole. It totally works. I'm a big fan of acrylamide grouting. I'm not trying to knock it all, but it is almost as thin as water. That's what they tout it as. With that, your volumes, even though it's inexpensive, can go way up because you use a lot. You can't really control where it goes. You can adjust the set times, but all these things that we imagine in our head when we're picturing, trying to engineer a job, they go out the window when you're standing inside that manhole looking at the concrete wall, because you don't know exactly what your grout did out there. So now you don't know exactly what to do. So it's important to have a bunch of different tool sets that you can go to. With two component, the other big advantage, and it took me a long time to learn this, is when you look at CMU block walls. First off, if there's one thing that I have come to hate in my life, it's CMU block. It is a cheap building material, and when it's used below grade, it's a nightmare to waterproof. Any cost savings you have by using that CMU block, they're totally gone when you go to waterproof this thing. You can spend so much money filling that with single component, but the best thing is you come in and you can fill all the cavities with two component. You have a slow two component that it's designed for void fill and not lifting, and you can fill all that area, and then you come right through those joints with your single component and inject and do your normal curtain grouting behind that. That's that 1-2 punch again that I was talking about. It's just amazing. And also, when you're looking at culverts and manholes, a lot of times after we identify these leaks, we identify them because they've been leaking for a while. And what does that mean when they've been leaking for a while? We have a void there. We have some problems. And so being able to hit that first with two component to really nail that up, rather than getting in there and you're 10 gallons into single component, you're like, oh, we're not even making a dent in this, you know? So there is, but again, like I said, two component, it can't do everything. And that's why single component shines. And there's very few flexible two components, and that's a very rare thing. I've used it a couple times. The Buchanan Dam down in Texas is one of them. It's the scariest project I worked at. This dam is 180 feet tall. It's built in the 30s, and it's only 3 foot thick. And they're Roman arches, so that's how they deal with all the weight there. So it's totally sound structure. But I was all weirded out. Hey, we're going to drill halfway through this 3 foot. Are we good with that? And I expected the engineers to come back and, with this whole big math thing and stuff. Their answer to me was, oh, we've chipped half of it away. So, that didn't make me feel real comfortable with it. But in that way, anyway, I got off on a tangent there. But we were using a flexible two component because we needed something that went off like instantly, because we barely had anything. We had cold water and about 1.5 feet to shut it down in. So again, as we talked about before, always talk to your manufacturer. Those are stuff that in the weeds. They don't have this out for everybody, because there's no point in mass producing that kind of stuff. It's specialty products. Urethane shine for that, same on the single and dual component side.
Well, speaking of that, just to make sure we have all our bases covered, are some of the things that we spoke about last time when you're choosing single versus dual. Do things like the environment weigh into, other than what you're trying to actually accomplish, but climate, topography, seismically active, does that weigh into the best choice for this as well?
It does some. And typically when we're talking about seismic areas, you're going to have an engineer that's helped design this. When they're looking at liquefaction and those kind of things.
Right.
I'm not an engineer. I understand. I watched some amazing videos about liquefaction. It's super cool, except if you're experiencing it. That's not so cool.
Yeah.
Grouts definitely have it, and I've seen. Matter of fact, I owe someone a response. So you can call me out on LinkedIn. I haven't got back to you. I apologize. But I had someone send me an outstanding report on how chemical grouts deal with liquefaction, and they did a bunch of testing. And it was spectacular for that. But that's what we need, those engineers that'll design that. And from there, we look at, okay, these are the quantity or these are the properties they need. Let's look at which is going to give this the best result. From my understanding and from various things I've worked at, oftentimes we look towards single component for stuff like that. The reason being is single component is more of a permeation grout. And I use that lightly. It's light permeation, because when you look at it like acrylamide, that's a permeation grout. Same with like a sodium silicate, okay? Urethanes can do some permeation, and we have some that do really well for that, but they have no expansion. And so I said before, they're expensive. When you don't have expansion on a single component, they're super expensive. But they can permeate, and the strengths they can give is just incredible. So they're very appropriate. Whereas when you look at two-component, compaction grouting is typically what you get out of that. That's where you formed a bulb and you squeeze the soils together rather than permeating. If you take a bulb of say like single component and two component, they were done in the same soils, let's say a loose sand or a large sand, and you cut those open, you're going to find the single component has a small core of urethane and then has a lot of that sand that's part of its structure, and it just kind of grows through there uniformly. Whereas the two component, you will find that it's mostly foam in there with just a little edge where it's incorporated some of that sand because it's done the compaction there. So it's just different chemistries in how they go off. The other big thing to keep in mind is that two components, since they react, once they mix, once they come out the end of the gun there, they have a limited time. And granted, there's chemistries that they can go out, a minute, maybe 2 minutes or stuff before they go off. But that limits you on how far you can pump. And it also means that you can't stop for very long, because if you do, you're going to clog your lines there. Single component, I could put a 200-foot pipe in and grout 200 feet away, at the end of my pipe, and not worry about losing my pipe because it's not seeing water until it comes out the end of it there. So single components give you a lot of versatility for getting it to locations. I've also had situations where I've had an engineer call me up, and they were talking about a tailing dam, and they were having a sinkhole appear. And I was like, oh, man, you don't want to talk to me. You just want to pour concrete in that and be done with it. That's much cheaper. And he agreed with me. He said, yeah, that's exactly right, except the 4 miles of road to get to this tailing dam has been abandoned, and the cost of reinstating that so we can get concrete up there is enormous. We could take your single component urethane on the back of ATVs and go and do this. Yes, it's more on product cost, but it's just going to save so much time, mobilization, and cost right there. So sometimes urethanes are chosen for that. And I use that example because even with that, the two component would also have been better. And we use it for mine abandonment all the time. But because of the access to that, single component shines there. And that's the same thing when you're working in like wetland areas that have manholes and stuff like that. A lot of times just being able to go in there just with a hand cart and bring your equipment in there, a little Yeti battery pack running your pump there, it makes it very easy to mobilize. When you compare the two chemistries, the end result is very similar. They're going to have similar resistance. They both don't like UV, but two component, when you start talking about voids and strength, typically you're talking a two component type job there. And especially for voids, single components can do some stuff with voids, but it's hard. But two component, it just shines. And yes, I'm sure some people will go, well, what about exotherm? That's a legitimate thing. I mean, when you look at two component, it is very similar to the two component we use to spray in the walls for insulation. So it is insulator. So the bigger lift you do means that it's holding the heat of polymerization in its core. So the bigger the lift, the harder that core can get. And yes, it can char and whatnot. We have, and when I say we, I'm talking about the industry, that there are products that are low exotherm that you can do larger lifts and that kind of thing. But for void fill, two component really, really shines. So, and you see that a lot of times with culverts. Both single component, two component, totally beat concrete hands down when it comes to where you have areas with subsidence and voids. Because if you come in with cementitious, which is going to be cheaper than both, and dump that in there, first off, it may flow out before it sets up. That's always an issue there. But even if it sets up in the right area, you've now added 150 pounds per cubic foot there. All right. If you're already subsiding, you've just thrown an anchor to someone who's floundering in the water. It's going to go right down there.
Wow.
You come in with a 2-component foam, it's a 2-pound foam, or even a 6-pound foam. Even if you want something super strong, you're under a highway, that's 6 pounds per cubic foot. That floats, okay? So we are actually lightening the load there by filling it and putting a structure repair. So both single component are much lighter than concrete, if that's something you need. The other thing when you look at grouting with 2 components and single is the speed of what you can accomplish with what you're looking at. Concrete, you need to have time for it to set. And the 2-component, they can literally shut down roadways at night, do their work, and 45 minutes later have it back open to traffic. All right. So that's quite an impressive thing there. Again, we have to look at what the costs are and how we have to mobilize. And I'm sorry, I kind of went off the tangent and brought concrete into this versus the other polyurethanes, but that's really what we compare against. So
yeah, that's great. No, because it's all points for consideration. Is that, as we mentioned in the last episode, is like there is no one size fits all.
No.
And I loved how you said it makes sense to be able to apply both. So you've got a comprehensive toolbox to handle any situation that might come up where you're doing this. So that was great advice, Charlie. Really appreciate that. So if folks who are listening in would like to get a hold of you, maybe tune into your rants and learn more about what you're doing and pick your brain, how can they do that?
Again, LinkedIn's going to be the best way to reach out to me. I'm right on there, and I actually have my phone there. If you look at my contact information, I'm right there. I don't try to hide, and I don't enjoy all the spam mail I get and phone. But
nobody does.
It's part and parcel of it. So yeah.
That's great. Well, I wish you luck with the rants, and I look forward to hearing more about them once a week, because they're quite fun and they're quite enjoyable. And you make a technical subject, or what one would consider very dry, very enjoyable, and make you go, why didn't I ever think of that? Or I didn't know that. So listeners, I invite you to tune in. I think you're going to get something out of this, and learn something that you didn't know before. I know I did. So I want to thank you again, Charlie, for coming onto the show, and these 2 wonderful, very entertaining, or I would say edutaining episodes about the subject of grout. And thank you, audience, for sharing your time with us today. And until next time, keep it flowing. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you're ready to take your marketing to the next level and start increasing sales and opportunities for your business, reach out to us at Creative Raven. We're here to help you thrive in the digital landscape. Visit creativeraven.com or click the link in the show notes below to schedule a call and learn how we can support your growth. If you enjoyed the insights on today's episode, be sure to hit subscribe so you'll never miss an update. Until next time, keep growing and keep it flowing.